Okay, everybody. So yesterday we were continuing to work our way through the John Adams presidency. What I want to bring you back to today is part in our notes where it says the aspects of the Alien and Sedition Acts. So when we look at the presidency of John Adams, there are certainly many things that we could look at to say, okay, what here has historical significance? But I would argue that the Alien and Sedition Acts, the group of laws that are all passed together that kind of have a common theme, this is what really sticks out. And then these laws will be referred to later in the course, looking back in history. And just so you know, the Alien and Sedition Acts are not viewed as a positive element. They're viewed as a negative element, mainly because what I believe somebody pointed out yesterday, I think it was Quinn, that when you limit what can be published in newspapers, especially, that's a violation of the First Amendment. And any time that presidents or the government interfere with our personal freedoms or civil liberties, that's usually going to go down in history as a negative. So let's go through the aspects of these Alien and Sedition Acts one more time, just to kind of get this solidified in your head here. It says that basically the U.S. government could deport or detain foreigners during wartime. Also, foreign people could be deported during peacetime. So what we wanted to do was, if we caught one of those evil Frenchmen trying to infiltrate our government, we wanted to be able to kick them out. But when you have a law with this amount of latitude, what this basically does is it makes it's viewed as like xenophobic or fear of foreigners. The idea of, oh, you're foreign, can't trust you, we're going to kick you out. So not a great law. The second thing is that what they did was they made it so that you had to live in America for 14 years before you could become a citizen. And this was just a blindly political maneuver. The Federalists did not want immigrants who were largely Democratic Republicans voting because they knew that if immigrants voted, the Federalist Party would have less power. So that's kind of nakedly political. And then I have this underlined here, number 3. This is the real big one. The Sedition Act basically said that newspaper editors could be fined or imprisoned for criticizing the president, Congress, or another government official. So what we did was, in the name of safety and in the name of being scared of going to war with France, we basically made it so that you could not criticize the president or the government. And we know that in our country, we very much value the ability to speak honestly about our public officials. We saw yesterday in this primary source that, the Federalists did have arguments. They said it shouldn't be allowed for newspaper editors to slander and lie about public officials. But this is kind of something that comes along with the freedom of the press, that the things that, where you bend the truth or it's not 100% completely honest, that stuff still gets published. And it's something that if you're elected to office, you kind of have to deal with. Now, at the end of class yesterday, I was explaining to you how the Democratic-Republican response to the Alien and Sedition Acts are viewed as very important because, people like Thomas Jefferson knew that the Alien and Sedition Acts were a humongous constitutional overreach. So they claim that this is a violation of the First Amendment, and because the Supreme Court in the 1790s does not yet have the power to rule that laws are unconstitutional, James Madison and Thomas Jefferson basically took it upon themselves to put into writing why they felt like the Alien and Sedition Acts were illegal and why they thought that these laws should not have to be followed. So being that we have more time today and we're not like rushing at the end of class, let's take a look at what James Madison wrote about the Alien and Sedition Acts. And his writing goes down in history as the Virginia Resolutions. Madison writes, by enacting the Alien and Sedition Acts, Congress was exercising a power not delegated by the Constitution. So what he's saying there is that the government is going beyond what the Constitution says it can do, but on the contrary, expressly and positively forbidden by one of the amendments. So he's saying that the First Amendment says you have freedom of the press. So Madison is basically saying that this is a violation of that First Amendment. A power which, more than any other, ought to produce universal alarm. He's saying that Americans should be scared because it is leveled against the right of freely examining public characters and measures. So what Madison is saying is that as Americans, we should have the right to examine the people who are in office. If they're doing something wrong, we should be able to write about it. And of free communication among the people thereon, which has ever been justly deemed the only effectual guardian of every other right. So what he's saying is that when people have the right to speak and the right to publish whatever they want, that's the best way to protect your freedom. Because in writing or through speech, you can make other people aware that wrongdoings are going on. So he's basically arguing for the power of why you need free speech and free press. And then if we go down to what Thomas Jefferson wrote, and this is something I point out as being important yesterday, it says, the several states who form the instrument of the Constitution, being sovereign and independent, have the unquestionable right to judge of its infraction, and that a nullification by those states of all unauthorized acts is the rightful remedy. So Jefferson is arguing that the states were around before the country was. And as a result, if the country passes a law that the states feel like is unconstitutional, the states can what he referred to as nullify, very important word, nullify an act of Congress and say, we don't believe that law is constitutional, thus we don't have to follow that law. And like I said yesterday, just be aware that this was the same argument used by states prior to the Civil War for why they did not have to follow certain laws of the federal government, especially laws involving slavery. So we see that this writing from 1798 is used much later in history as an argument for states' rights. That's the significance. So let's just read through this one more time. It says, both writers supported the concept of nullification and expressed the belief that the Alien and Sedition Acts violated the First Amendment. This word nullification, right? This keeps coming up over and over again. It's the belief that states willingly chose to enter the country. Thus, states could break that compact. If they wanted to leave the country, they could. And states could nullify federal laws that violated states' rights. And it became a huge debate. Can states leave the country? Can they not leave the country? Can states choose not to follow certain laws? Some people said yes. Some people said no. And that debate does not get settled until the Civil War in the 1860s. So what is the significance? Jefferson and Madison articulated a view of states' rights that would be invoked by states in secession debates in the 1830s, in the decade prior to the Civil War. Okay, so we will see that again. All right, the last little part of our notes here. We have one more page, and this part we're going to fly through a little bit quicker. The next part says the effects of the Alien and Sedition Act. So we passed the laws. What did they do? Okay, so here is something that was printed in a newspaper. Let's read it together. That would be punishable by the Alien and Sedition Acts. This is a primary source. It says, the reign of Mr. Adams, we're talking about John Adams as president, has been one continued tempest of malignant passions. As president, he has never opened his lips without threatening or scolding. He is a repulsive pedant, a gross hypocrite, and one of the most egregious fools upon the continent, a hideous hermaphroditical character, which has neither the force or firmness of a man nor the gentleness and sensibility of a woman. Do any of you out there realize what this passage is saying about John Adams and why it's so critical? Do you know what a hermaphrodite is? Have you ever heard this terminology? That's kind of an old school terminology. A hermaphrodite is somebody with both male and female sexual organs. So basically they are saying about John Adams, he's part man and part woman, but he's really neither. He's like the worst of each, okay? So that's kind of a pretty serious claim against the president in terms of being insulting, right? They said he's a gross hypocrite. He's an egregious fool. So this is the kind of thing that you would see in a Republican newspaper, and this is the kind of thing that you would hear on like cable news today. If you turned on Fox News, they'd probably be saying awful things about Biden. When Trump was president, you heard CNN say awful things about him. So this is a part of our political landscape. Let's go down to our second primary source. Here's another quote from a newspaper that would have gotten people in trouble. Before it is too late to retrieve our deranged affairs, people must demand the immediate resignation of old, querulous, bald, blind, crippled, toothless Adams. Bald, blind, and toothless. Okay, so these newspapers are going right at Adams, attacking him personally. They're attacking his body, the way he looks, right? His health conditions. So just be aware that this is the kind of thing that John Adams hated, and these were the kinds of things in newspapers that the Alien and Sedition Acts hoped to get rid of. So it says here that these acts, the laws, were not widely implemented or enforced, but they were still controversial. All right, let's read this, because this is something that actually happened. Like, this is a real consequence. The first person convicted was a Republican congressman from Vermont. His name was Matthew Lyons. He criticized Adams and the federal government, and as a result, for what he wrote in the newspaper, he was sentenced to 4 months in jail and a fine of $1,000. You could probably guess how the Democratic Republican Party responded to this. Like, you took one of our guys, you threw him in jail, and you fined him $1,000, and it's only because he expressed a political opinion that the president and the Federalist Party did not agree with. In the span of 3 years, when these laws were in effect, the federal courts prosecuted 26 people under the Sedition Act. So let me ask you, is that a lot of people? 26? Not really. But one thing I want you to be aware of is that the laws were so symbolically bad and so symbolically unconstitutional that even though only 26 people were prosecuted, history views the Alien and Sedition Acts very negatively, despite the small number of people who were prosecuted. Pretty much all 26 of those people were all Democratic Republicans. So this law was used to silence the opposing political party, which is not good. All right, so let's move on to our last few things. And these parts are going to be a little bit quicker. The Treaty of Montfontaine. So people in John Adams's political party, the Federalists, were saying, go to war. Let's go to war with France. We were involved in this quasi-war with France. John Adams never wanted to go to war with France, and he held out for peace until the very end. And what happens in 1800? France officially agrees that France and America are, from this point forward, at peace. So John Adams should get credit as president for avoiding war. The Federalists really were pushing him to go fight. He said, I refuse, and we're gonna hold out for peace, and that's what happened. So the worst moment of John Adams's presidency is the Alien and Sedition Acts. The best moment of John Adams's presidency is that he resists the temptation to go to war, and he eventually arranges a peace agreement with France. So that's a good thing. So what else? John Adams had some cabinet problems. As John Adams's presidency, his first term, kept going, Hamilton was pushing for war. And the way that Hamilton was pushing for war was that he was telling the men that he controlled in the cabinet, hey, you're loyal to me. Tell the president to go to war. So Adams got to a point where he was so mad at the men in his cabinet, he called them all into his office, well, all with the exception of one. And he basically says, I want all of your letters of resignation tomorrow. So he basically fires his entire cabinet because he feels like they are not loyal to him, and he replaces them all. So that was a lesson to future presidents, that when you take over, you always form your own group of advisors who you make sure are loyal to you and not to someone else. So his advisors were loyal to Hamilton, not to him. So every president after Adams learned the lesson that you always pick your own people who you trust. You don't just inherit a cabinet from the last president. All right, so let's go through the last couple headings here, and then we'll kind of review together. In the election of 1800, John Adams ran for re-election. John Adams lost, becoming our first one-term president. Does anybody know, when you are president and you run for re-election and you lose, Quinn, how does that reflect upon your historical legacy? Do you know? Do you have a guess?
It shows that people didn't like you.
Yeah, so when you run for re-election, it's a referendum on you. Did people like what you did the first term? When you don't get reelected, that's a sign that people wanted to vote maybe not for somebody else, but against you. And we see that people did not like John Adams very much. So who beat him? His vice president, Thomas Jefferson. So we're going to learn more about 1800 when Thomas Jefferson is elected. But that election is a big deal because this was the first time ever in history that somebody from the other party, the Democratic Republicans, got to be president. And one thing that we know is that in our current political system, we always bounce back and forth between Republicans and Democrats, and they kind of take turns being president. And every time that one party hands off to the other, it's usually been peaceful. That kind of changed this time. We had a little bit of violence, from supporters of the outgoing president. But usually in our history, we're able to pass it, back. And even I think President Trump learned his lesson after the Capitol riot. He kind of toned down his rhetoric and said, all right, on my way out, I'm not going to inflame the people anymore. So that's what happened. Thomas Jefferson takes over, and it's pretty peaceful. John Adams is the first one-term president. And another thing, Adams is the last Federalist ever elected president. So Washington and Adams were the only people who were Federalists who ever became president. And then after the election, after Adams loses, the Federalist Party starts to go on the decline. And I'll explain to you why that happened. All right, let's go through the conclusion here. Okay. It says events during the 1790s caused the friendship between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson to deteriorate. So if you go back to the Revolution, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were best of friends. They lived in Europe together as diplomats. They were really, really close, but they really had a falling out, a really bad one. Adams and Jefferson resumed their friendship in their old age. They started writing letters to each other, and both Adams and Jefferson died on the same exact day on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. So, what are the chances of that? Two best friends. They were the two most important people in the American movement for independence. They have a huge falling out during the 1790s. They become friends again in old age over long distances, and they die on the same exact day on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. You cannot make that stuff up. That is a crazy story that it sounds like it's invented, but it actually happened. All right, everybody. So now we are done with George Washington and John Adams. With the time we have remaining, would it be helpful if we did a big study guide real quick together on the 1790s to help you with your quiz? You can nod your head if that sounds good. Okay, sounds good to me too. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open a Google Doc. If you want to write this down, you can. And on a piece of paper, it might help you for your quizzes that you have to do for me. But I'm going to type it so that you can see it. So I'll give you just a few seconds if you need a piece of paper or a notebook or something like that, and we'll go through this together, okay? Okay, everyone good? Everyone got a pen, something like that? Or remember, I am recording this video, so if you need to open this file and then just fast forward to this part, you can do that as well. Okay. You can all see my screen. Okay, so the first thing I want to go over with you is number one, the first political parties. Okay. Your essay is about how events during the 1790s caused the first political parties. So we need to know a little bit about them, right? Just, in general, if we're going to write about them, what do we need to know? Let me see. So you should know that the first party was called the Federalists, and that was the party of Hamilton and his ideas, right? Then you had the Democratic Republicans. And that's the party of Jefferson, his ideas. All right. And then you have chart was given to you. Explain the differences. And this is on Google Classroom. So if you are doing your quiz and you need a detailed breakdown of the two political parties and you need to be able to visualize what they both represented, you have that, okay? And then the last thing I want to put about the first political parties was they were formed during the presidency of George Washington. And they continued into the presidency of John Adams. Okay, so that's kind of my first part, just a general overview, that's who the parties were, that's what we should know. The next thing I think we should go over together is the presidency of George Washington. Okay, so what do we need to know? So I gave you a detailed PowerPoint. You have that. If you need the intimate details, you can look that up. So the way I'm going to organize this is, let's see here. First thing I'm going to say is his first term. So, like, what do we need to know about, like, George Washington's first term in office? It was dominated by economic issues. Specifically, Hamilton's economic plans. Okay. So I don't want to go into like every little teeny tiny detail, but I do want to focus on the big things. So in terms of his first term, like what would be a big financial issue? The idea of the assumption plan. Like the idea to combine state debts into one national debt. Okay. The second big thing, and then I'll put at the end there was a compromise. Okay. Second big thing I would say is the argument over whether we should have a national bank. This was a huge debate. Okay. The big thing I would say about the national bank is that the debate was over loose construction of the Constitution versus strict construction of the Constitution. I know this is a hard question, but does anybody out there feel like they remember anything about that debate? So, should we have a national bank? What is the difference between a loose construction of the Constitution versus a strict construction of the Constitution? Anybody remember out there?
Loose gives some freeway from the Constitution to kind of go based off it, but not exactly, and strict follows it word for word.
Yeah, exactly. So, Mary, that's excellent. So basically, you have to follow word for word, and then we'll put next to loose construction of the Constitution. That's the idea that the Constitution can be interpreted in a flexible way. Now, the reason why that's important to the bank debate is that Alexander Hamilton says, well, if you interpret certain provisions flexibly, then you could argue that it says that a bank's okay. But if you interpret it in a more strict Jeffersonian way, if it doesn't say you can create a bank, then you can't create a bank. So that really kind of helped split us into two. Like, do you believe it word for word, or do you believe it in a flexible way? Okay, so those are the two big things in Washington's first term. Oh, and then I'll put one more thing. There was a liquor tax. And this is in history called the whiskey tax. And this was the idea, to help pay the debt. Okay, so that's like something that kind of comes into play a little bit later. I wouldn't say that was really politically divisive, but the idea that the U.S. government was passing new taxes was something that a lot of people didn't like. Now, let's go to the second term. Okay, what do we need to know about George Washington's second term? This was dominated by foreign policy issues and a crisis. Okay, so let's do the crisis first. We call this the Whiskey Rebellion. Make sure you know that it was farmers in Western Pennsylvania protesting the whiskey tax. It was put down without violence, and all protesters, let's call them rebels, all rebels were pardoned by Washington. Let me ask all of you, does history view Washington's handling of the Whiskey Rebellion positively? Yes, exactly, Quinn. Absolutely. Okay, now the next heading, foreign policy. Right? Big thing you need to know about his foreign policy is he wanted neutrality in the war between Britain and France. So he could have chose Britain. He could have chose France. Instead, he declares neutrality. That is his big, decision. I am not going to pick a side, but we're gonna trade with both sides. The other big foreign policy item, right, was the Jay Treaty. I would argue that the Jay Treaty, this was like an agreement with Britain to avoid war. That this event did more than any other to help form rival political parties. Okay, that's my argument. You don't have to take it nonetheless. I would argue that both on economic and foreign policy issues, we divided up. But the Jay Treaty really was the most heavily protested that Washington was during his entire presidency. Okay. So let's now go with our time we have left to the presidency of John Adams. Okay. Let's do this instead. Okay. So with the presidency of John Adams, the big event that you need to start with is the XYZ. Actually, before we do that, with the presidency of Adams, I want to type something as the big picture. Problems with France and involving France dominated the presidency John Adams. So basically, everything that he deals with in some way is involved with France. First big event is the XYZ affair. What this was a scandal. The U.S. sent diplomats to France to negotiate a peace. The American diplomats were bribed by corrupt French agents. And then the news traveled back to Americans. That's basically the XYZ affair. It showed Americans that France was a corrupt country and they were not treating us fairly. So what did this lead to? Let me do this here. It led to American outrage, demands for war against France. It also led to something called the quasi-war. This is an undeclared naval war against France. Okay. The other big event of the Adams presidency is the Alien and Sedition Acts. So the goal was to be able to deport foreigners, foreign people, specifically immigrants, right? And then it restricted, let me go down here, freedom of the press. Okay? And there was a harsh Democratic Republican backlash against the laws. So that led to, we'll put this here, something called the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. This was Madison and Jefferson And they argued that it was a violation of the First Amendment and that states had the right to nullify federal laws. And one last thing, we'll put the Democratic, Republican newspaper editors were fined and put in jail. Okay, guys, what I did for you was I tried to put everything that you would like. If somebody said, "What is the least amount that you need to know about the 1790s?" This is what I would say. Okay, I hope that's helpful. And what I think I'll do for you is, I think I'll just probably, even though I know you wrote this, and I'm glad you did write it because now like it helped you review and it's in your head. I'll see if I can post this file as well on the classroom in case you need it. All right, so before I end today, is there any question or any topic that you want any clarification on before we go? I will happily answer anything, everything. Hopefully this document is helpful. You have it written down. I'll post it on the classroom. If there's any lingering questions you have, I will take them at this time about anything at all 1790s related. Quinn, yes.
I just have a quick thing. Like, why would the Federalists want war with France if, like, France helped us during our own war, and Britain is the one that like we tried to separate from? Like, why would Federalists try to get with Britain and then cause war?
That's a great question, Quinn. So, number one, France helped us. But what happened in France after the American Revolution? And we should probably put this in our file. Go ahead.
The French Revolution?
Yeah, so underneath the presidency of George Washington under second term foreign policy, I'll add differing opinions about French Revolution. So Federalists, Quinn, did not agree with what was going on in France after the king was killed. They said, this is not a country we want to emulate, or this is not a country we want to help. The Federalists are so concerned with the economy of the United States that they say, forget France, Britain, and our alliance with them is what is going to, make our country financially prosperous. So does that make sense that like we had nothing to gain from France and they had kind of lost control of their government? Whereas the Federalists say the future of our country is with trading with Britain. And we know that we can't be friends with both of them. So we should gear our attention and our friendship and our alliance towards Britain for those financial reasons and for, those kinds of things. So great question. Quinn, any other further questions, or you feel like you're good? Okay, that was a good one. I'm glad you brought up because I did leave out the French Revolution, which is a big topic, and that helps divide us up. Okay, everybody, so I will post this file on my classroom. You have part A of your quiz is 6 multiple choice questions, and part B of your quiz is your essay part. Those are due by midnight on Monday night. Starting next week, we're going to move into the presidency of Thomas Jefferson. Okay? All right, all. Thanks for coming. Good job as usual, and have a great weekend, okay? I'll see you.
Bye.
See you.